It was simply a portrait of a wealthy plantation mistress and her enslaved domestic worker until historical experts noticed a concealed, forbidden truth. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the receiving dock of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., signing for a postal package that had arrived without any return address. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2024, unseasonably chilly, and she had served as curator of the Civil War photographic collection for 12 years. In that time, she had accepted hundreds of donations, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, cartes de visite, each one offering a glimpse into America's most turbulent historical period. However, something about this particular package immediately drew her professional attention. The container was small, meticulously wrapped in plain brown paper with only her name and the archive's street address written in neat block-style letters. There was no phone number, no email address, just a brief typewritten message tucked inside. Dr. Mitchell, this specific photograph has been in my personal possession for 3 decades. I obtained it from an estate liquidation auction in Charleston, South Carolina. I genuinely believe it possesses significant historical importance, but I strictly do not wish to be personally identified. Please examine it with great care. Some things are truly not what they initially seem. The truth holds more importance than my personal name. Sarah felt a familiar surge of professional curiosity. Anonymous gifts were uncommon, yet not entirely unheard of. Sometimes, people inherited items with difficult or troubling pasts and preferred them to be properly archived without their personal involvement. She very carefully lifted the photographic print from its protective wrapping material. It was a carte de visite, a small mounted photograph popular during the Civil War period, roughly the exact size of a modern business card and in remarkably excellent condition considering its age. The resulting image displayed 2 individuals posed in a formal photography studio, setting against a painted backdrop featuring classical columns and elegant drapery. On the left side stood a white woman, approximately 28 to 30 years old, wearing an elaborate silk garment with a wide hoop skirt, fitted bodice, and delicate lace collar, typical of affluent Southern women in the early 1860s. Her hair was styled in the popular fashion of the era, parted precisely in the middle and pulled back smoothly. She stood with a very confident posture, one hand resting lightly on an ornate side table, her facial expression serene and composed. Her expensive clothing and authoritative bearing communicated wealth, high social status, and the assured confidence of someone completely accustomed to having authority. On the right side stood a black woman, visibly younger, perhaps 22 to 24 years old, wearing a simple yet well-constructed dress of dark-colored fabric with a plain white collar. Her hair was fully covered with a simple white head wrap, which was typical for enslaved domestic staff. Her hands were clasped firmly in front of her, her posture was upright, but her shoulders were slightly curved inward. Her facial expression was intentionally neutral, her eyes cast slightly downward in the highly deferential manner socially expected of enslaved individuals when being photographed alongside their enslavers. The overall composition was entirely typical of Civil War-era photographs explicitly intended to document the supposedly benevolent relationship between enslavers and the enslaved. They were propaganda images meant to justify the entire institution of slavery by falsely portraying it as a paternalistic social system where enslaved people were supposedly well cared for and entirely content. Sarah had viewed dozens of similar photographs before. They invariably made her feel deeply uncomfortable, visual documents of brutal oppression staged to resemble complete harmony. She carefully flipped the photograph over. On the back, written in faded brown ink, was a brief notation: Caroline Ashford and her girl Rachel, Charleston, South Carolina, March 1863. Just those few precise words. No last name was provided for Rachel. No indication of their connection beyond the chilling, possessive, her girl. This was regrettably standard practice for the period. Enslaved individuals were rarely granted the dignity of full legal names or recognized identities in official records. Sarah placed the photograph onto her specialized examination table under proper archival lighting and reached for her professional magnifying loupe. Something about the anonymous donor's cryptic note still deeply troubled her. Some things are not what they initially appear. What had the donor visually observed that prompted such a mysterious message? She began her standard examination protocol, systematically looking for any signs of damage, alteration, or unusual hidden details. The photograph looked completely authentic. The correct paper stock, mounting style, and printing technique for 1863. There were no obvious signs of recent manipulation or forgery. But as Sarah closely examined the faces through her magnifying loupe, something started to persistently nag at her professional instincts, something she could not quite identify yet, but which made her lean even closer, her pulse quickening with the familiar sensation that a significant historical discovery was waiting to be unveiled. She picked up her phone and called her longtime colleague, Dr. James Warren, who specialized in the forensic analysis of historical photographic prints. "James, could you please come to my office? I urgently need a second professional opinion on something," she asked. "Give me 10 minutes," he replied promptly. Sarah redirected her attention back to the photograph, to those two faces brutally separated by the intense social hierarchy of 1863 Charleston. Caroline Ashford, the plantation mistress. Rachel, whose last name was deemed completely unworthy of recording. But something about those two faces was beginning to unsettle Sarah in ways she could not yet fully articulate. She reached for her high-resolution digital scanner, knowing she needed to examine this specific image at a far higher magnification level than her loupe permitted. Whatever the anonymous donor had noticed, Sarah was absolutely determined to uncover it. Dr. James Warren arrived with his portable digital microscope and specialized laptop, the essential equipment that had already helped them authenticate and carefully analyze countless historical photographs. He was in his mid-40s, highly methodical and precise, with the patient demeanor of someone who deeply understood that historical truth often reveals itself slowly, detail by meticulous detail. "What exactly do we have here?" he asked, setting up his equipment carefully on Sarah's workstation. Sarah handed him the photograph and the anonymous note. An 1863 carte de visite from Charleston, a plantation mistress and her enslaved domestic worker. Standard propaganda composition for the era, but the donor explicitly instructed me to examine it very carefully, stating that things aren't what they initially appear. James first studied the image through Sarah's magnifying loupe, his professional expression entirely neutral. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Have you already noticed the facial structure?" he inquired. Sarah felt her pulse quicken again. "I was starting to—" "Yes," she admitted, "but I wanted your specific analysis before I shared any thoughts." James connected his digital microscope to his laptop and precisely positioned the photograph beneath its lens. The magnified image appeared on the screen, and he began systematically examining it at increasing levels of magnification, starting with the overall composition before zeroing in on specific facial details. "Let's commence with basic facial mapping," he suggested, opening specialized software routinely used by forensic analysts to compare specific facial features. He started marking key points on Caroline Ashford's face: the measured distance between her eyes, the width of her nose, the distinct angle of her cheekbones, the shape of her jawline, and the positioning of her ears relative to her eyes. Then he moved to Rachel's face and began marking the exact same measurement points. Sarah watched the screen intently as the software generated overlay comparisons. Even before the full analysis was completed, the strong similarities were becoming undeniably clear. "The interocular distance is almost identical," James stated quietly, his voice adopting the focused intensity he always exhibited when making a significant discovery. The same ratio of face width to face length. The cheekbone structure is nearly identical. Look closely at the jawline. The angle is precisely the same. And here, he continued, the specific shape of the ears, the exact way they sit relative to the eyes. That characteristic is genetically determined and remarkably similar in these two women. He zoomed out to display both faces side by side on the screen, with all the measurement overlays clearly visible. Sarah, these two women share significant facial structure similarities, far more than would ever be expected from random chance. Sarah leaned even closer to the screen, her mind racing through the immediate implications. "A familial connection?" she asked. "Almost certainly," James confirmed with conviction. "The high degree of similarity in this many facial features strongly indicates they share close genetic heritage. Sisters, potentially, or mother and daughter, although the age difference appears too small for the latter," he concluded. A profound chill went through Sarah. She had studied enough about the antebellum South to know precisely what this revelation most likely implied. White plantation owners routinely committed rape against enslaved women. The children resulting from that appalling violence were themselves enslaved, half-siblings to the white children of the household, yet treated strictly as property rather than as family members. "If they are half-sisters," Sarah began slowly, "that means Caroline Ashford's father." James finished the grim thought. Raped an enslaved woman, and then enslaved his own biological daughter. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence, James elaborated. Historians currently estimate that a significant percentage of enslaved people in the antebellum South had some white ancestry, usually resulting from rape perpetrated by enslavers. But to possess photographic evidence this visually clear, with facial structure this remarkably similar, this constitutes truly extraordinary documentation. Sarah stood up and walked over to her window, looking down at the heavy Washington, D.C. traffic below, trying to fully process the historical atrocity they were uncovering. "The anonymous donor knew it," she stated. "That is precisely why they wrote that things aren't what they initially appear." This photograph is not merely routine propaganda about the supposed benevolence of slavery. It is direct documentation of a white woman actively enslaving her own half-sister. We still need more concrete evidence before we can make that definitive claim publicly, James cautioned. Facial similarity is highly suggestive but not entirely conclusive. We need historical documentation, birth records, specific plantation documents, family genealogies, and, ideally, if we can successfully locate living descendants, DNA analysis would provide the definitive proof. Sarah turned back to look at the photograph displayed on the screen. The note mentioned an estate auction in Charleston 3 decades ago, in 1994. If this photograph truly originated from the Ashford family estate, there might be other papers, personal letters, plantation ledgers, or family Bibles still out there. We must find out absolutely everything we can about Caroline Ashford and her immediate family. James nodded in agreement, already typing extensive notes into his laptop. "I will begin by searching the Charleston historical records. The Ashford name should be well documented. Wealthy plantation families typically maintained very extensive records. And if Caroline survived the Civil War, there will be census records, property documents, possibly even newspaper mentions." "What about Rachel?" Sarah pressed. "Will we manage to find anything about her existence?" James's expression became somber. "That will prove much more difficult. Enslaved people rarely appear in records under their own full names before the Emancipation Proclamation. But if she survived the war and lived into the Reconstruction period, there might be subsequent census records, Freedmen's Bureau documents, possibly even specific church records if she became literate and was active in the local black community." Sarah returned to her desk and carefully photographed the carte de visite from multiple distinct angles using her high-resolution camera, creating a complete digital archive of the image. Then, she turned the photograph over and photographed the inscription on the reverse side. "Caroline Ashford and her girl Rachel," she read aloud. "Not even her servant or her maid, just her girl." That possessive language is so completely casual, so absolute, James noted. The precise language was meant to reinforce the property relationship. Enslaved individuals were not truly considered people. They were mere possessions, like furniture or livestock animals. Sarah began actively searching historical databases while James continued his meticulous forensic analysis of the photograph. The Ashford name immediately appeared within the Charleston records. They were a prominent family, very wealthy plantation owners who had been established in South Carolina since the early 1700s. "Found something," Sarah announced. Robert Ashford, the plantation owner born 1798, died 1865. He owned Ashford Grove Plantation, approximately 3,000 acres, and possessed over 200 enslaved people. He had one legitimate daughter, Caroline Ashford, born 1834. She married Thomas Peaton in 1856, but became widowed in 1862 when he was killed fighting for the Confederate cause. She then returned to her father's plantation, which is where she would have been residing in 1863 when this specific photograph was taken. So Caroline was approximately 28 or 29 years old in this photograph, James confirmed. That age matches the visual appearance. "What about any siblings?" he asked. "Brothers or sisters?" "No legitimate siblings are listed," Sarah replied. Caroline was an only child, at least officially documented as such. The word "officially" hung heavy and significant in the air between them. They both instantly recognized what that single word implied. Robert Ashford may have had only one legitimate white child, but he almost certainly had other children. Children born to enslaved women, children who were never publicly acknowledged, never given his family name, never granted their rightful inheritance or freedom. Children just like Rachel. For the entire following week, Sarah and James worked with obsessive focus, methodically constructing a documented case about the Ashford family. They requested detailed records from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, the Charleston County Public Library's historical collection, and several university archives that housed Civil War-era plantation documents. The Ashford family's history unfolded in meticulous detail. Robert Ashford had inherited the plantation from his own father in 1825 and substantially expanded it, amassing a significant fortune from rice cultivation by exploiting enslaved labor. He was a prominent figure in Charleston society, served in the state legislature, and was a vocal public defender of the institution of slavery in the years leading up to the Civil War. His daughter Caroline had been educated at an expensive finishing school, married well to Thomas Peaton, a rice factor from a similarly affluent family, and had lived in Charleston proper until her husband's death at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862. "Look at this," James said, pulling up a digitized plantation record dated 1850. "This is an inventory of Ashford's enslaved people required for tax purposes. Over 150 individuals are listed, including their approximate ages and assigned work roles. And right here, a woman named Sarah, age 23, listed as a house servant." Sarah leaned over his shoulder to read the faded, spidery handwriting. In the cold, clinical language of property inventory, real human beings were reduced to mere entries in a ledger, names, ages, arbitrary monetary values, work assignments. If Sarah was 23 years old in 1850, Sarah calculated, she would have been approximately 37 in 1863, certainly old enough to be Rachel's mother. "Keep scrolling through the list," James instructed. "See if there are any children explicitly associated with Sarah." Sarah scrolled down the digital document. The enslaved people were listed in family groups whenever possible. although these families could be easily separated and sold away at any moment. Under Sarah's entry, there was a specific notation: one child, female, age 3, named Rachel. There, Sarah breathed deeply. Rachel, age 3, in 1850. That would make her about 16 or 17 years old in 1863. She looked up at James. That's younger than she appears in the photograph. Enslaved people's ages in these specific records were often only approximate, James explained. Enslavers did not always maintain accurate records of enslaved people's births, and the extremely harsh living conditions, malnutrition, and hard manual labor often caused enslaved people to appear older than their actual chronological age. They continued searching through plantation records, slowly building a timeline of Rachel's constrained life as it was documented in the sparse, fragmentary record. She was listed in subsequent tax inventories in 1855 and 1860, always identified as Sarah's daughter, and always assigned to housework rather than grueling field labor. Then they found something that made Sarah's blood run utterly cold. It was a plantation ledger from 1855 documenting the annual distribution of new clothing to the enslaved workers. Most of the entries were routine and predictable. Men received 2 shirts and 1 pair of pants annually. Women received 2 dresses and 1 head covering. But there was a shocking handwritten notation in the margin directly next to Rachel's name. Give extra fabric this year. Master's orders. Girl looks like family. Keep her in house, away from visitors. Oh my God, Sarah whispered. They knew. Robert Ashford knew Rachel visibly resembled his legitimate family, and he explicitly ordered her to be kept hidden from outside visitors who might notice the painful resemblance. James was already photographing the document with his high-resolution camera. This is direct documentary evidence that Rachel's visual appearance was unusual enough to warrant special, secretive attention. Combined with the forensic facial structure analysis, this strongly suggests she was Robert Ashford's biological daughter. A profound rage began to build in Sarah's chest, not the hot, impulsive anger of the moment, but the cold, sustained fury that comes from documenting historical injustice in such precise, damning detail. Robert Ashford had raped an enslaved woman named Sarah. When their daughter Rachel was born, he then enslaved his own child, and as Rachel matured and her resemblance to his white daughter Caroline became more and more apparent, he deliberately hid her away, knowing that her very face revealed his unforgivable crime. "We need to find out what ultimately happened to Sarah," Sarah stated firmly. "Rachel's mother, is she listed in any later records?" James pulled up the 1860 tax inventory. He scrolled quickly through the names, then immediately stopped. Here, Sarah, age 33, house servant. But look at the tragic notation written next to Sarah's entry in different ink, as if added much later. Deceased, September 1860. No cause of death is listed. Sarah was only 33 years old when she died, and the plantation record didn't even bother to document how or why. She had simply ceased to exist as far as the plantation's bookkeeping was concerned. "So Rachel lost her mother in 1860, Sarah said very quietly. She would have been about 13 years old, and then she was left completely alone in that house, enslaved by her own father and half-sister." They continued their focused research, finding more fragmented pieces of Rachel's life scattered throughout the documentary records. She even appeared in Caroline's personal diary. James had successfully located a transcribed version in a university archive, but Rachel was only ever referred to as the girl Rachel or my maid. Caroline mentioned her very casually, the way someone might mention a useful household object. One entry from January 1863 was particularly chilling to read. "Father insists I have my portrait made with Rachel before he passes. He claims it will visually demonstrate that our family treats our people with Christian kindness. I suppose he is correct, though I find the whole tiresome affair quite tedious. Rachel will need a respectable dress for the photograph. I shall have my old blue silk garment altered to fit her frame." The photograph was entirely Robert Ashford's idea, James summarized. He was actively dying. He passed away in March 1865, according to the official records, and he wanted to create a final visual record that misleadingly portrayed his enslavement of his own biological daughter as an act of Christian kindness. Sarah stared intently at the transcribed diary entry. Caroline had written about posing with her half-sister for a propaganda photograph with the exact same bored tone she might use to describe any other tedious social obligation. There was absolutely no indication that she understood or cared about the profound injustice of the situation. "We must find descendants," Sarah insisted, "both Caroline's white descendants and Rachel's descendants, if she had any children. DNA analysis could definitively prove they were half-sisters." "And if we can successfully prove it," James added, his voice rising, "this photograph transforms into something truly extraordinary, documented evidence of one of slavery's most hidden and awful crimes, the enslavement of one's own children." While James focused on searching for genealogical records, Sarah returned to the photograph itself. The anonymous donor's note kept echoing persistently in her mind. "Please examine it carefully. Some things are not what they initially appear." They had successfully identified the facial similarity, the historical records documenting Rachel's specific presence in the Ashford household, and even Caroline's diary entry about the photograph session itself. But Sarah had the nagging, persistent feeling that there was still something else, some additional crucial detail hidden within the image itself. She set up her professional scanner, a high-end flatbed model capable of capturing resolution far exceeding what the human eye could perceive, and carefully positioned the carte de visite. The scanning process took nearly 30 minutes at the maximum settings, creating a huge digital file that required specialized software just to open and examine. When the scan was complete, Sarah loaded it onto her large monitor and began the painstaking, methodical process of examining every single millimeter of the image at extreme magnification. She started with the painted background, the studio backdrop, the floorboards, the ornate side table where Caroline rested her hand. Nothing unusual was found there. They were standard studio props of the period. She moved to the clothing, examining the fabric textures, the precise buttons, and the lace details on Caroline's collar. Then she focused on Caroline's jewelry, a small brooch at her collar, a simple ring on her right hand, visible where it rested on the table. Then Sarah moved to Rachel's side of the image. The simple dark dress, the plain white collar, the head wrap. Rachel's hands were clasped firmly in front of her waist, her fingers interlaced in a pose that appeared entirely formal and submissive. But as Sarah steadily increased the magnification to the maximum the scan allowed, something immediately caught her eye. Rachel's hands were not merely clasped together. They were positioned very deliberately, and she was clearly holding something small between her palms, something tiny, mostly hidden by the careful positioning of her fingers, but partially visible if you knew exactly what to look for. Sarah's heart began to pound heavily. She instantly adjusted the contrast and brightness levels, bringing out minute details that had been lost in the shadow for 161 long years. It was paper. A small piece of folded paper, no more than 2 inches square, clutched tightly between Rachel's palms and intentionally concealed from any casual observation. "James!" Sarah called out, her voice tight with raw excitement. "You absolutely need to see this now." James rushed to her side and she quickly showed him what she had discovered. At normal viewing size, Rachel's hands appeared to be simply folded in the standard pose of a servant. But at extreme magnification, the hidden paper was undeniable proof. She was holding something specific during the photograph session, James noted, wonder evident in his voice. Something she consciously concealed from the photographer and from Caroline, something small enough to successfully hide in her clasped hands. The vital question is, what exactly was written on that paper? Sarah asked. And even more importantly, does it still exist physically? James pulled up the anonymous donor's note on his phone and carefully reread it once more. Please examine it carefully. Some things are not what they initially appear. The donor absolutely knew about this hidden paper, he realized. That is precisely what they wanted you to find. Which means, Sarah finished the thought, they might actually possess the paper itself. She looked at the small, partially visible corner of paper hidden in Rachel's hands 161 years ago. What vital message had been so important that Rachel risked hiding it in a photograph that would inevitably be carefully examined and permanently preserved by the very family that had enslaved her? We urgently need to find the donor, Sarah declared. The original package had been mailed from a postal facility in Charleston, South Carolina, but had no return address and no identifying information. Sarah immediately contacted the Postal Service, but without a formal warrant or active criminal investigation, they could not provide sender information. She tried a different, strategic approach. The anonymous note had mentioned acquiring the photograph from an estate auction in Charleston 3 decades prior, in 1994. Sarah reached out to her contacts at the Charleston Historical Society and began searching meticulously for records of estate sales from that specific period that might have involved the Ashford or Peaton family names. It took 3 intensive days of phone calls and database searches, but finally she found a promising lead. In June 1994, the estate of Margaret Peaton Thornton had been liquidated at auction in Charleston. Margaret had passed away at the age of 98, the last surviving direct descendant of Caroline Ashford Peaton. Sarah quickly obtained a copy of the original estate sale catalogue. It listed hundreds of various items: furniture, silver, paintings, books, and notably, miscellaneous historical documents and photographs, various dates. Approximately 150 items were listed in total, sold together as a single lot. That's definitely it, James said when Sarah showed him the catalog entry. The photograph must have been part of that lot. Someone purchased it in 1994 and held onto it for 30 years before finally sending it to you. But why? Sarah wondered out loud. Why retain it for 3 decades and then abruptly donate it anonymously now? She posted carefully worded inquiries on various genealogy forums and historical society message boards, asking if anyone had specific information about items purchased from the Thornton estate sale in 1994. She was very careful not to reveal what they had already discovered, simply stating that she was attempting to trace the precise provenance of a recently donated photograph. A full week passed with no replies. Then, on a Monday morning, Sarah received an email from an address that consisted only of random numbers and letters, clearly a temporary account created specifically for this communication. Dr. Mitchell, I am the specific person who sent you the photograph. I have been closely following your research career for several years and was confident you would give this artifact the serious, in-depth investigation it truly deserves. I purchased a box of assorted Ashford family papers and photographs at that estate sale in 1994. I was a history graduate student at the time, keenly interested in Civil War-era material culture. When I carefully examined the box's contents, I discovered the photograph you now possess, along with several other items I firmly believe you should see. I have delayed coming forward until now because Margaret Thornton's children and grandchildren were still alive and quite prominent within Charleston society. I did not want to cause undue pain to living people who bore no direct responsibility for their ancestors' actions, but the last of them passed away 6 months ago. It is now time for the full truth to be publicly known. If you wish to examine the other materials from the estate sale, I will make precise arrangements to meet with you in Charleston. I still prefer to remain entirely anonymous for my own personal reasons, but I will willingly provide you with absolutely everything I have. Reply to this email if you are interested in proceeding." Sarah read the message 3 times in a row, her mind racing excitedly. The anonymous donor possessed more materials, potentially even more evidence concerning Rachel and the Ashford family. Perhaps even a conclusive explanation for what Rachel had been holding tightly in her clasped hands during the photograph session. She looked at James, who had been reading over her shoulder. "I have to go to Charleston immediately." "We both do," he agreed. "If there are additional documents, we will need to authenticate them and create a complete archive." Sarah replied to the anonymous email instantly. "I'm extremely interested in examining any additional materials you currently possess. When and where would you prefer to meet? I can travel to Charleston entirely at your convenience. Thank you immensely for entrusting this vitally important historical evidence to the National Archives. Dr. Sarah Mitchell." The expected response arrived within the hour. "Saturday at 2 p.m. at the Charleston Archives and History Center, 161 Meeting Street. Ask for a private examination room. I will personally deliver the materials to you there. I will not stay. I will simply drop off a labeled box and leave immediately. Please examine absolutely everything with great care. The truth about Rachel is far more extraordinary than you currently realize. And yes, the paper she was consciously holding in the photograph is definitely included in the materials." A deep chill ran down Sarah's spine. The tiny paper Rachel had hidden 161 years ago still existed physically. Whatever vital truth Rachel had been desperate enough to conceal during that forced photograph session, whatever profound truth she had attempted to preserve while being compelled to pose as her half-sister's contented slave, Sarah was now on the brink of discovering it. Sarah and James flew to Charleston on Friday evening and checked into a nearby hotel in the historic district. Neither of them managed to sleep well that night. The intense anticipation of what they might uncover the next day made rest entirely impossible. At 1:45 p.m. on Saturday, they arrived punctually at the Charleston Archives and History Center, a modern building that housed one of the finest collections of low-country historical materials in the South. Sarah had reserved a private examination room, a climate-controlled space equipped with the proper archival handling tools, designed specifically for researchers working with fragile historical documents. They waited quietly, making small talk in an attempt to distract themselves from their mounting nervousness. At exactly 2 p.m., there was a gentle knock on the examination room door. Sarah opened it to find a staff member holding a plain cardboard box. "This was just dropped off at the main front desk for Dr. Sarah Mitchell," the young woman explained. "The person who delivered it didn't provide a name. They just stated you were expecting it." "Did you happen to see who dropped it off?" Sarah inquired. "An older person, maybe in their 60s or 70s, wearing a hat and sunglasses. I honestly couldn't determine if it was a man or a woman. They were only at the desk for about 30 seconds. Just set the box down, said it was for you, and left immediately." Sarah accepted the box. It was much heavier than she had expected, and she thanked the staff member. She closed the door firmly and carefully set the box onto the examination table, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation. "Let's see exactly what we have," James said, pulling on a pair of archival gloves. Sarah did the same, then very cautiously opened the box. Inside were multiple items, each meticulously wrapped in acid-free tissue paper and carefully identified with handwritten notes on index cards. The first item was a leather-bound diary, its cover cracked from old age. The accompanying label read, "Caroline Ashford Peaton's Personal Diary, 1862-1867, complete and unedited. Note, entries marked with red tabs." The second item was a bundle of letters tightly tied with faded string. The label read, "Correspondence between Caroline Ashford Peaton and her cousin Anne Middleton, 1863-1865. Note, letter dated April 1863. The third item was a small, worn Bible, its leather cover worn completely smooth. The label read, "Bible from Ashford Grove Plantation. Check the births and deaths page, handwritten entries." And finally, wrapped in multiple layers of tissue paper, was a small folded piece of yellowed paper, brittle with extreme age. The simple label read, "This is what Rachel was holding. Read it first." Sarah and James exchanged a stunned look. With visibly trembling hands, Sarah carefully unfolded the extremely fragile paper, supporting it gently on a clean piece of archival mat board to prevent any tearing. The paper had been folded very small, small enough to successfully hide in clasped hands, but when fully opened, it measured approximately 4 inches square. The edges were clearly torn, suggesting it had been forcibly ripped from a larger document. Written on it in careful, precise handwriting that had faded to a light brown over time were these explosive words: "I, Robert Ashford, being of sound mind, do hereby fully acknowledge that Rachel, daughter of Sarah, is my natural daughter, born of my body, and is kin by blood to my legitimate daughter, Caroline. This statement is written entirely in my own hand as a true witness. God forgive me for the evil I have knowingly done. April 7th, 1863. Below the text was a single defiant signature, Robert Ashford. The examination room went absolutely silent. "It's a complete confession," James finally whispered. "A written, signed confession that Rachel was his biological daughter." Sarah stared at the small, powerful paper, trying to fully process the historical implications. He wrote this in April 1863, just 1 month after the photograph was taken. He was clearly dying. The records show he passed away 2 years later. This was effectively his deathbed confession. But why would he even write it down? James asked, perplexed. He had kept Rachel enslaved her entire life. Why confess now in private? Guilt, perhaps, Sarah suggested, or perhaps a deep fear of divine judgment. He was dying, and maybe he desired some kind of record of the truth to exist, even if he never publicly acknowledged it. But how on earth did Rachel manage to get hold of it? James wondered aloud. This document is written in Robert Ashford's handwriting, most likely composed in his private study. How did an enslaved young woman gain access to her enslaver's signed confession? Sarah carefully photographed the document from multiple angles before responding. "That is precisely what we need to figure out. Let's examine the other materials provided." Sarah carefully opened Caroline's diary to the very first page marked with a red tab. The entry was dated March 15th, 1863. "Father is gravely ill. The doctor says his heart is failing and he has perhaps 6 months remaining. He has become deeply melancholic and speaks constantly of his sins and his fear of eternal judgment. This morning, he unexpectedly asked me to bring the girl Rachel to his study, which I found peculiar, as he has never shown any particular interest in her before. They spoke privately for nearly 1 hour. When Rachel finally emerged, her facial expression was quite strange. I cannot adequately describe it. Not exactly tears, but something profound had clearly transpired. Father absolutely refused to tell me what they had discussed. He only said that he had made his peace with something that had long troubled him." The next marked entry was dated April 10th, 1863. "Something truly extraordinary and deeply troubling has occurred. 3 days ago, Father summoned me to his study and confessed something that has completely shaken the foundations of my entire understanding. He solemnly informed me that the girl Rachel is not simply our servant, but is in fact my half-sister, that her mother, Sarah, was his. I cannot even bring myself to write the awful word. He said he had personally written a specific document acknowledging this terrible fact and had given it directly to Rachel herself, telling her she was truly his daughter and asking for her forgiveness. I was absolutely horrified. I immediately asked him if he intended to finally free Rachel, to publicly acknowledge her. He admitted he did not possess the courage for such an act, but that he wished her to know the truth privately and to possess his written word as concrete proof should she ever require it. He then asked me to treat her with far more kindness, since she was, in fact, my sister. I honestly do not know what to think or feel now. My world has been completely turned upside down. Sarah felt her throat constrict as she finished reading. Caroline had known the truth. After the propaganda photograph was taken, she had learned that Rachel was her own half-sister, and Robert Ashford had given Rachel his written confession directly into her hands. The next marked entry was dated June 2nd, 1863. I am genuinely trying to fulfill Father's dying wish to treat Rachel with more kindness, but I find it immensely difficult. The ingrained habits of a lifetime are not easily broken. She is still a Negro, still a common servant, regardless of whose daughter she may ultimately be. Today I directly asked her if she still possessed Father's paper, the one acknowledging her parentage. She simply replied that she kept it safely hidden. I asked where it was hidden. She firmly refused to tell me. I was initially angry. How dare a servant refuse to answer my direct question? But then I remembered that she is also my sister, and perhaps she has a compelling reason not to trust me with such sensitive information. Father died last month. That paper is absolutely all she possesses of him, the only acknowledgement she ever received of her true identity. I suppose I truly cannot blame her for guarding it so carefully. James was reading intensely over Sarah's shoulder. So Rachel kept the confession safely hidden somewhere, and when the photograph was taken in March, she intentionally concealed it in her hands right under Caroline's watchful eye. It was a profound act of defiance, Sarah realized. Perhaps the only act of defiance she could safely make at that time. She could not speak the truth openly. She could not publicly claim her true identity, but she could deliberately hide the proof of it in a photograph that was explicitly meant to show her as a contented slave. She was literally holding the physical evidence that everything in that photograph was an utter lie. They continued through the diary, reading entry after entry that documented the strange, twisted, and contradictory relationship between the two half-sisters. Caroline never actually freed Rachel. She continued to treat her primarily as a servant, even while privately acknowledging that they shared the same father. The severe cognitive dissonance in the diary entries was striking. Caroline writing about my sister Rachel in one sentence and then immediately referring to her as my maid in the next, never quite able to fully reconcile the fundamental contradiction. Then they discovered the pivotal entry that changed everything. It was dated December 28, 1865. Rachel has finally left. She simply walked away 3 days ago and has not yet returned. She waited until the brutal war was completely over, until the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was fully ratified and there could be no legal question whatsoever of her newfound freedom. Then she took her few meager belongings and father's paper, I am entirely certain, and departed without uttering a single word. I suppose I should be extremely angry, but I find that I am not. I am, in fact, profoundly relieved. Her constant presence was a perpetual, painful reminder of Father's awful sin and my own painful complicity in her continued enslavement. Perhaps now I can finally forget and move forward with my own life. I wonder if I shall ever see her again. I wonder if she will ever truly forgive any of us. She escaped, James stated, relief clearly audible in his voice. Rachel survived the war's end and finally walked away when she knew she was legally free. And she took the confession document with her, Sarah added. That paper was her ultimate proof of identity, her fragile connection to her father, her irrefutable evidence of the truth. She kept it safe her whole life, most likely. They moved on to the bundle of letters next, quickly locating the one marked April 1863, the correspondence between Caroline and her cousin Anne Middleton. Caroline had written to her cousin shortly after finally learning about Rachel's true parentage. "Dearest Anne, I must confide in you a terrible and shocking secret that has been revealed to me," the letter began. "Father has confessed that the girl Rachel, who has been serving in our household since the day she was born, is actually his biological daughter by one of our slaves. She is my half-sister, Anne, my very own sister, and I have treated her as a mere servant her entire existence. I honestly do not know how I can possibly rectify this monstrous situation. Father gave her a paper specifically acknowledging her parentage, but what practical good is a mere paper when she still remains completely enslaved? Yet I cannot bring myself to free her. The scandal would utterly destroy our family's reputation, and I would be shunned entirely by Charleston society. So I choose to do nothing at all, and I feel the agonizing weight of my profound cowardice every single day. Tell absolutely no one of this secret. It must remain completely secret until I am in my grave. Your deeply troubled cousin Caroline." The final, most poignant item in the box was the original family Bible from Ashford Grove Plantation. These Bibles were very common in wealthy families, large, leather-bound volumes where births, marriages, and deaths were meticulously recorded in handwriting on special pages located at the front and back of the book. Sarah very carefully opened the fragile Bible to the records page. The entries were in multiple distinct handwritings, written over many decades. The earliest entries dated back to the 1790s, recording the births of Robert Ashford's own parents and grandparents. Then came Robert Ashford's own birth in 1798, his marriage to Elizabeth Middleton in 1830, and the birth of his legitimate daughter, Caroline, in 1834. But there was one other single entry, added in a completely different ink and clearly written much later. It was desperately squeezed into the margin of the page, as if someone had been trying to add it without being immediately noticed. "Rachel, daughter of Robert Ashford and Sarah, born 1847, sister to Caroline." The handwriting was visibly shaky but entirely determined, and at the bottom of the page there was a crucial note written in the exact same hand. "This precise entry was made by me, Rachel Ashford, on December 20th, 1865, immediately before I permanently departed this place. I add my rightful name to this family record because I am family, whether publicly acknowledged or not. I was born right here. I lived here as an enslaved person for 18 horrific years. My father was Robert Ashford. My sister is Caroline. These facts are immutable truth, whether written in this Bible or not. But now they are written here, and anyone who reads this will know the truth. Rachel." Sarah felt hot tears immediately burning in her eyes. Rachel had finally claimed her rightful place in the family record. Before walking away forever from the plantation where she had been brutally enslaved by her own family, she had written herself directly into their Bible, asserting her true identity and her absolute right to be remembered. "She documented herself," James said quietly, his voice filled with admiration. "She ensured there was a permanent record, even if no one publicly acknowledged it during her difficult lifetime." They spent the next several intensive hours carefully examining and photographing every single document. Each new piece added another painful, vital layer to Rachel's extraordinary story. The diary showed that Caroline knew the truth all along, but deliberately chose personal comfort and social acceptance over profound justice. The letters revealed that other family members had been told the devastating secret, but had unanimously agreed to keep it perpetually hidden. The confession proved that Robert Ashford had known exactly what he was doing, enslaving his own biological daughter, and had felt guilt, but tragically, not enough guilt to actually free her. and the Bible demonstrated that Rachel had courageously fought back in the only way available to her by documenting the undeniable truth, by claiming her identity in permanent writing, and by fiercely refusing to be erased from history. "We absolutely need to find out what happened to her after she left the plantation," Sarah insisted. "Where exactly did she go? Did she have children? Are there living descendants?" James was already intently searching on his laptop. Freedmen's Bureau records, post-war census data, church registries. If Rachel lived anywhere in the South after 1865, there should be some kind of traceable record. It took 3 intensive days of searching, but they finally found her. In the 1870 U.S. Census for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there was a specific entry for Rachel Ashford, age 23, Negro literate, occupation seamstress. She had deliberately kept her father's name, and she had triumphantly survived. Over the subsequent days, Sarah and James meticulously traced Rachel's life forward through further census records and city directories. She had lived in Philadelphia for over 40 years, working initially as a seamstress and later as a dedicated teacher in a school specifically for black children. She had married in 1872 to a man named Joseph Freeman, a carpenter and a Union Army veteran. They had 3 children, Robert, named after her father, perhaps as a profound act of reclamation, Sarah, named after her courageous mother, and Caroline, named after her half-sister, suggesting that Rachel had somehow managed to make peace with that complicated, painful relationship. Rachel Freeman passed away in 1912 at the age of 65, surrounded by her loving children and grandchildren. Her death certificate specifically listed her parents as Robert Ashford and Sarah. Even at the very end of her long life, she had successfully claimed her full, true identity. 4 months after the initial anonymous package arrived, Sarah successfully traced living descendants from both Rachel's and Caroline's family lines. From Rachel's side, they found James Freeman, a retired teacher residing in Baltimore, and his sister, Dr. Patricia Freeman Johnson, a physician practicing in Atlanta. From Caroline's side, they located Elizabeth Peaton Harrison, a practicing attorney in Charleston, and her brother, Michael Peaton, a business consultant in Virginia. Rachel's black descendants responded with profound, emotional validation. James Freeman revealed that family stories had always spoken of an ancestor who was enslaved by her own white father, but they had always assumed it was an exaggerated legend. Learning that Rachel's confession paper, the Bible entry, and all the documentation were entirely real brought both tears and immense relief. "Rachel truly deserves to have her truth publicly confirmed by science," he declared, immediately agreeing to DNA testing. Dr. Patricia Freeman Johnson expressed similar sentiments, noting that their family had always been aware of white ancestry through brutal rape, but had never known the full horror of a father actively enslaving his own daughter. Caroline's white descendants initially resisted the findings. Elizabeth Peaton Harrison flatly refused to believe her family could have committed such an atrocity, labeling the research absurd and threatening legal action. However, her brother, Michael, responded quite differently, admitting he had always suspected dark secrets lurking in their family history and agreeing to face the truth, regardless of what it finally revealed. DNA testing conclusively proved that Rachel and Caroline were indeed half-sisters, sharing the exact same father. The results were irrefutable science. Genetic markers showed a sibling relationship with 99.9% certainty across multiple testing companies. Sarah organized a major press conference at the National Archives, displaying the 1863 photograph alongside the forensic facial analysis, Robert Ashford's damning written confession, Caroline's revealing diary entries, and the family Bible with Rachel's handwritten claim to her true identity. The story instantly went viral, covered extensively by major news outlets worldwide. Elizabeth Peyton Harrison eventually confronted the undeniable evidence and issued a public statement acknowledging her ancestors' terrible crimes and offering a formal apology to Rachel's descendants. The two families later met privately, a deeply emotional and highly moving encounter where they examined the original photograph together, seeing Rachel holding her father's confession safely in her clasped hands, her profound act of silent resistance meticulously preserved for 161 years. The photograph subsequently became the centerpiece of a permanent Smithsonian exhibit titled "Hidden in Plain Sight: Rachel's Testimony." Rachel's descendants finally had irrefutable scientific proof of what their wise grandmother had always told them. The once respectable Ashford-Patton family legacy was permanently rewritten to include the dark truth: a father who mercilessly enslaved his own daughter, and a young woman who courageously refused to be permanently erased from history.